Welcome to the Athena Wellness Podcast, the show that invites you to take a seat around the community fire and listen to stories that inspire. I'm your host, Kathy Robinson, author, coach, and founder of Athena Wellness, a company that's dedicated to supporting you on your journey to live more wholeheartedly. Hello, and welcome to episode 83. Thanks so much for joining me. Have you ever dreamed of leaving your current life behind to sail the tropics? I know I have. When I was in my 30s, I remember buying every book I could find of couples who did just that. They bought a boat, learned to sail, and set off for the islands. I did my research and found it was actually doable. Thankfully, I aligned that dream with my innate personality preferences and realized that my Taurian earth nature would not be a good match to living on the water full-time. My guest today, Paul Trammell, did a similar assessment, but he came to a very different conclusion. And he takes us on a story-filled journey from growing up in West Virginia to becoming a teacher for a brief period of time before settling on the northern Florida coast as a musician and a carpenter. When Paul decided to get sober, he promised himself a 1-week sailing class as a reward when he reached his 1-year sobriety anniversary. That trip was the gateway to the life he lives today, as a writer and a sailor living aboard his boat full-time. Here's what we cover. An overview of Paul's journey that brought him to being a full-time solo sailor. The decision process to completely leave his old life behind. How sobriety supported turning his dream into a reality. A glimpse into the depth, presence, and intentionality of the solo sailing life. And what big dream is on his horizon. Paul was incredibly generous with his time, so this is a long episode. But it's rare to come across someone who turned his dream life into a living reality. And what I love about Paul's approach is how he designed his life to align with what matters most to him: nature, adventure, creativity, and solitude. This episode is sure to give you some inspiring and practical ideas on how to redesign your life to live more wholeheartedly and turn your dream into a reality. And as always, I'll put links to Paul's contact information, his books, and his socials in the show notes. And now on to the show. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Paul, welcome to the Athena Wellness Podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So please share a bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, I live on a sailboat and I'm currently in Panama, and I'm an author. I left land 2 years ago. Yesterday, it was actually 2 years.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, I bought this boat 2 years ago in Massachusetts, and a few months before that, I sold my house, which I'd owned for probably 20 years. And that was the big break from living on land. I sold the house and bought the boat, and haven't really been back. I've lived on the boat the whole time. I've had to live on the boat, in a marina a couple of times, and on the hard where the boat's out of the water and I'm working on it. I had to do that for about 8 months at one point. But other than that, I've been sailing in the Bahamas and now Panama.
Unbelievable. We're going to get into life on sea, but tell me a little bit about life on land before you decided to become a sailor. Where did you grow up and how did you make a living as an adult before doing what you do now?
Well, I grew up in West Virginia and went to college in Melbourne, Florida, studied biology. I didn't really know what to do after college. So in my senior year, I applied for graduate school at WVU, my home state of West Virginia. I went back, spent 3 more years in school, and still really wasn't sure what to do for a profession. I ended up teaching school for 1 year, and it was probably the worst year of my life, teaching ninth grade at a boarding school. Just was not for me. And ended up moving back to Florida and getting a job as a carpenter. And I had a variety of jobs in the beginning of my first 5 years or so in Florida, but carpentry, which was always sort of a backup job, ended up being my career because my main dream when I was living in Florida for 23 years was to be a musician. And carpentry is a good job for an aspiring musician because you can sort of set your own schedule and you never have to work at night. So I was a musician for 23 years, guitar player in various bands. And eventually that all sort of changed all of a sudden when I quit drinking. And then I developed all of a sudden I had a new dream, which was to be a sailor and a writer. And I spent a few years planning and preparing and trying to figure out how to make that work. And eventually, 2 years ago, pulled the trigger and left land for good, hopefully.
Mm. It sounds like the two things that you were doing, carpenter and musician, come in very handy in your life now, being able to do what you need to do on board as well as entertaining yourself. So it sounds like that was a good it was a good prelude.
Oh yeah, to be a sailor, you really have to know how to fix things because there's nobody else out here to do it for you. You can't just hire somebody to work on your boat. I mean, sometimes you can, but it's extremely expensive if you can find someone. And if you're out at sea, there's nobody. It's just you.
Right.
So you have to have some kind of mechanical inclination just to do it at all. But to have been a professional carpenter, I'm able to do most of the work on my boat. Mm-hmm. And that otherwise it wouldn't have been possible. It's just too expensive to hire someone to do that kind of work. Anything that has to do with a boat is like double the price of what it would be otherwise. Labor included.
Have you ever been in a position where you had to MacGyver something, something like duct tape and toothpaste and a piece of string?
Oh, you bet. You bet I have. I was sailing from North Carolina to the Bahamas when I had just bought this boat. I'd had the boat for about 3 months and I'd been working on it quite a bit, but it's an old boat. It's 1972. And I was probably 300 miles from land on the other side of the Gulf Stream, sailing south from North Carolina straight to the Bahamas. And the alternator quit working. Mm. Now you can sail without an alternator, but you need to have electricity because you've got instruments running, and at night you turn your lights on. So you need electricity. Now I've got solar panels, so I should have been all right. However, during this passage, my solar panels were always sort of facing away from the sun, so they weren't charging the battery. So I had to do something. And, one of the things I could have done was turn and go back to the United States and go into a marina somewhere and buy a new alternator. That was one of the plans, but I was just determined to get to the Bahamas. I did not want to have to do that. So the alternator quit working because the positive terminal post broke off. So where the big fat wire connects it to the battery actually. So it was not able to charge the battery because the connection of the wire to the battery broke off. It's a post. It's like a steel, but it's basically a bolt that sticks out of the alternator. It's sheared right off, right flush with the alternator. So there's no way to put that wire back on. So I had some time to think about it. I had a day or two before the batteries were going to run all the way out. And finally I got it. And I tried various things, various things that didn't work. But finally I got an idea. It was a calm evening. And I thought to myself, if I could drill a hole in that post, I could drive a different screw into it. And then I could somehow attach the big wire to that screw. So I got out my drill and the smallest drill bit and very carefully drilled a hole in the center of the broken post, and then made the hole bigger and bigger until I was able to drive a wood screw straight from my trim carpentry days. Wow. Stainless steel wood screw. I drove that into the hole of the steel post and then put the wire on that and then wrapped a bunch of copper wire around it to connect it. And then put an alligator clip on top of that and then wrapped it up in tape. I mean, it looked ridiculous, but it worked at least until I got almost to the Bahamas, and then it broke again. But it got me there. it got me there. I made it to the Bahamas. I pulled in with no alternator, and I think one or two things broke every day on that trip. I didn't have all my lights working. The alternator didn't work. Lots of things I didn't have gas. My gas stove quit working because the solenoid broke. Yeah, I had to MacGyver a few things on that trip, and that's common.
Yeah. I would say all that goes into the tank, right? Now, next time that happens, like, oh, I know what I could do.
Yeah.
Right. You're learning as you go.
Yeah, you bet. You gain experience that way. And, the funny thing is you tell a story like that to someone who's been sailing for a long time, and it's something they've heard 100 times and something they've done, because it's common for that sort of stuff to happen. It's difficult for anything to exist on a sailboat in a saltwater environment. It's always getting shaken and rocked and bounced around. It's a tough life for any kind of equipment on a boat. Things don't last very long.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, growing up in West Virginia, how did a kid growing up there get so interested in water and wanting to live on water? Or was that the driver?
Well, when I was very young, we lived in Louisiana. And at one point, my father had his own sailboat on Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. He got interested in offshore sailing, and he took me on. He would occasionally go on an offshore trip, like from Florida to the Bahamas, and about once a year for a few years. And he would either take me or my brother. We would alternate. So that's how I was introduced to it. And I'll never forget the first time that I saw the ocean, 360 degrees of ocean and no land. You look around and you don't see land. Like, that's a big deal to a kid, or to anybody, but especially to a 10 or 12-year-old. I remember waking up and coming upstairs and looking around and not seeing land for the first time. And it was just amazing to me. You can kind of see the curvature of the earth. There's no land anywhere. It's weird. And you think you kind of picture a map of the world and where you are on it. And it still gets me, when I'm out there. Every time I'm out there, I think the same thing. I think, wow, I'm on this little patch of the earth that's roughly 7 miles in radius, 14 miles in diameter is what you can see.
Mm-hmm.
Big 14-mile diameter circle, and there's no one else in it. It's just me. It's my own little private patch of the earth right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an amazing feeling. And I never forget that. I've never forgotten that feeling as a kid of seeing that. So that was my introduction to sailing. When I went to school in Florida, I got way into surfing and scuba diving and really fell in love with the ocean. And to me, the ocean, the big attraction of the ocean to me really is just that it's nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the woods, a forest, but it's just massive. It's 2/3 of the earth. It's huge. I love being deep in nature, whether it's in the forest or the ocean. And the ocean is as deep as you can get into nature, in my experience. When you're 300 miles from land and there's no one around, you have this feeling of being extremely deep in nature, more so than I've ever felt in a forest.
Mm-hmm. What are some of maybe one or two of the deepest connections that you have, whether it was with another creature or just a natural element? If you can just describe one or two of those moments that even after all of these years and all of this time, it still takes your breath away in awe.
Sure. I've had some great wildlife encounters. Some have been terrifying and others have just been awe-inspiring and wonderful. And one of the wonderful, two come to mind. One is sailing, same trip I was just talking about where my alternator broke. I was having a really nice day. I was standing up at the helm, steering the boat. And so I'm looking out. When you're steering the boat, you're looking at the ocean for hours at a time. And all of a sudden, a whale jumped out of the water out in front of me, just all the way out of the water, just out of the blue. Like, you haven't seen anything for days. And all of a sudden, this huge creature the size of a school bus leaped all the way out of the water and did it 3 more times. Mm-hmm. And you literally just cheer and yell, woo! It's just an amazing sight. Yeah. And then another time that was really cool, I was free diving in the Bahamas, snorkeling on a reef at Sandy Key. It's a protected, no fishing area, a nice protected reef. And I saw something big and dark, a big dark shadow in the distance, coming in my general direction. And And I thought, oh wow, what's this going to be? You never know what you're going to see when you're in the ocean. It could be anything. My first thought was that it was a manta ray because it was really big and close to the bottom. And then I realized it was an extremely large spotted eagle ray, not just one, a whole school of them, probably a dozen. And they were like 8 feet across.
Wow.
It's a ray, so it looks kind of like a manta or a stingray, but the tail is long and whip-like and like 10 feet long. The rays are spotted like a leopard. And the funny thing about eagle rays is they have a body underneath the wing. So most rays are kind of flat and there's kind of a lump of a body above the wing, and that's it. But the eagle rays have a body almost like a dolphin under the wing, and they have a head that sticks out in front of it. So they have a face. They have this funny, goofy looking face, and they're huge and they look like alien spacecraft, and they glide just above the bottom slowly. And I was able to swim with them.
Oh, wow.
And swim along with them and swim down to them and get right up next to them. And you can see they're stingrays. They have a barb. They have this big barb the size of like a large hunting knife, right by their tail. That's jagged, and you see it and like, okay, don't get close enough to make these things nervous, because rays are not aggressive. Rays are passive animals, and they have that weapon, but it's defensive. It's not an offensive weapon. It's defense. And they'll let you swim right next to them. You just don't do anything stupid like grab a hold of them
Right.
So that was just a wonderful wildlife experience.
It's one thing to MacGyver an alternator. It's another thing to MacGyver yourself. You don't want to have to do that, right?
Yes, absolutely. I've got some serious first aid kit on board, and I do everything in my power not to have to use it.
Yeah.
You have to be very careful living on a sailboat. You have to move slowly. You have to always hold on. You have to always think. When you're offshore and you're sailing and the boat's rocking and moving around, you don't just stand up and do something. You think about what you're going to do, and you think about what all the steps are involved in doing. And this could be something as simple as moving from the cockpit to down below.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just get up and do it. You think, okay, I'm gonna go down below. The first thing I'm going to do is grab a hold of this, and then step the right leg over there, and then I think about all the steps, and then I do it, and I try to do things like that the exact same every time.
Mm-hmm.
So that you get your safe method, and then that's what you do every single time. Because if you make one mistake, especially when you're sailing by yourself, you can make one mistake and all of a sudden you're overboard and your boat is sailing away from you, and you'll never see your boat again, and you're treading water. And I carry a PLB on my life jacket, so I could hopefully be rescued because of that. It's a satellite SOS device,
mm-hmm.
but still, I would be treading water for a day, 2 days. I don't know, just hoping. So, like I said, you do everything you can not to fall overboard. My life jacket also has 2 tethers with clips on the ends of them, and I'm always 100% of the time wearing that life jacket, even when I sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm not down below, I'm always clipped in. I'm always clipped to something. I'm always attached to the boat. It's kind of like wearing your seatbelt in a car. I just do it all the time. So always trying to be safe.
Mindfulness and presence abounds, right? You have to. There's no choice.
It is. You have to be very present, very in the moment. And there's a lot of time for meditation and just being clear-minded and just staring out at the ocean. There is an endless amount of that when you're offshore.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there's a lot to see. Sometimes there's dolphin. Sometimes there's strange things jumping out of the water. There's usually nothing. You're usually just looking at waves. But the waves are constantly moving, and it's this bizarre landscape that is always in motion. And every day you see the sunrise, and every day you see the sunset. And if it's not cloudy, you see stars every night. If it's a clear night, you see stars like you'd never believe. So many. And sometimes shooting stars are pretty common to see. I saw 13 shooting stars on one of my passages in the Bahamas this year.
Wow.
Fantastic. It's wonderful to see that many.
What's so amazing is that, the way you're describing your life, a lot of people will be listening to this and it seems like it's so unusual, but what's really unusual is that the rest of us, we're in this constant motion just like you are, and we are oblivious to it. You're just noticing it. You're in a place where you can actually see that and experience that.
Mm-hmm.
It's all happening around us too, but we're just so involved in whatever life is bringing us. I just think that's a
Yes.
fascinating parallel.
Yes. Well, I've really simplified my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's just me and the boat, and there's no driving to work. There's no traffic. There's no cars. There's not people distracting me all the time. And being a writer, I'm self-employed now, and yeah, there's nothing. I live a life where there's almost nothing to distract me, and I also live a life that's almost completely stress-free,
Mm-hmm.
which is something I've always sort of selected for, throughout my life. One of the reasons I didn't like that 1 year of teaching was because it was incredibly stressful,
Mm-hmm.
and I just don't want that at any price. I'd rather be poor and stress-free and happy than, have a steady job that I hated. That's really something I'm not willing to do at all, is have a job I don't like, because that's where you spend all your time.
And you have made these huge, huge changes, and these changes don't happen overnight. I mean, you were teaching a couple of decades ago, right? And then you had all of these other jobs, you bought a house, you were putting down roots. So when did this start to take shape? What was that decision-making process like? Selling your house is not a small decision, right? So how did this all kind of come together?
Yes, there were definitely some key turning points in my life, there were two major turning points that led to where I am now. The first was I was at a party, and I saw a friend who did not have a drink in his hand, and I said, "Hey, Jim, how are you doing?" And my friend Jim, he was smiling. I remember he looked nice, like he had on nice clothes, and I said, "Would you like a beer?" And he said, "No, I quit drinking." And I had known at that point that I needed to quit. And it had been a couple of years that I had like consciously been thinking about, like, someday I've got to quit because I drink way too much. And so Jim told me he didn't drink, and I said, "Wow, how did you do it, and why did you do it?" And Jim said, "Well, my brother died."
Hmm.
His brother was younger than me at the time when he died. And his brother died from a lifetime of heavy drinking. He died of internal organ failure, a long, slow, miserable death. And that was something clicked in my head right then and there. And the next day I was terribly hungover, had a bad day, skipped work, watched Netflix all day, ordered a pizza from Domino's that almost made me throw up. That was my rock bottom, which is not very rock bottom at all compared to most people. That's not a very impressive rock bottom, but for me, that was it. Like, I'm skipping work. I'm basically watching TV all day. I mean, I don't watch TV, but Netflix is as close as I get to it. And I said, this is it. Like, I've got to quit. And I did. And that's a whole story in itself, but I quit drinking right then and there, and never went back. That was turning point number one. The second one came almost a year into not drinking. I was looking for big adventures. I had always been an adventurous person, but all the heavy drinking and partying I'd been doing sort of took place of that. And I wasn't, the more I drank, the less I got into the wilderness, because I had to have a cooler full of beer. I couldn't go backpacking. I didn't drink liquor. I drank beer. You can't go backpacking as a heavy beer drinker unless you're hauling a cooler. So
Rolling a keg.
yeah. So I would go, car camping instead of backpacking. And so anyway, I'm looking for big adventures, and somebody suggested the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. It's a 650 square mile wilderness area that's all swamp, and there are canoe trails throughout the swamp. And there are platforms. There are probably a dozen platforms spread out over 650 square miles, a dozen platforms that you can camp on. And so the way you do it is you call the office, and they help you pick a time where because only one group is allowed on each platform at a time. So we scheduled a 5-day canoe trip for me. And every day you paddle your canoe about 5 or 10 miles. And at the end of the day, you find this platform. It's just out in the middle of nowhere in a swamp that may or may not have alligators on it. And you set up your tent and camp. And it was fantastic. That was deep wilderness. It was a huge adventure. And one morning, I think it was the second day, I'm paddling along, and I had this feeling like, wow, this is so much fun being nomadic. I'm moving every day. I'm on the water. I'm like, this reminds me of something. This reminds me of something wonderful. What is it? What is it? What is it? Oh, it reminds me of being on a sailboat. It reminds me of the first time I looked around and all I saw was water. Because now I'm looking around and all I see is this marsh and this swamp and alligators, and I'm moving and I'm on a boat. And it was like a light bulb went off in my head. I have to be a sailor. I need to get back into sailing. Sailing is the big adventure that I've been looking for. That's what it is. And now that I don't drink, I can do it, because I knew I wanted to be a sailor, but you can't when you have to drink a 12-pack a day. You can't do it. You can't bring enough beer. You can't sail offshore drunk. Even people who drink and who sail don't drink when they sail offshore. So that was a big turning point. I went after the Okefenokee trip. I went home and I got it on Amazon, and I found a book, a nonfiction sailing book. In fact, I remember which one. It's called Get Real, Get Gone by Rick Page and Jazz Natuda. And that's kind of a step-by-step how to quit your job and buy a boat and live on a boat. It sort of walks you through that whole process. Well, that was just the beginning. I read every nonfiction sailing book I could get my hands on, and learned a lot just by doing that. And then for my 1-year sobriety gift to myself, which I've been saving cash for, I bought a 1-week sailing class. And that really lit the fire. And I went on a couple of trips. I found a couple of offshore trips with other people I was able to do. One of them was through Crewbay, a website where you can, as somebody who wants to sail but doesn't have a boat, you can find boats who need crew. And so I sailed from St. Lucia to Puerto Rico with a guy I met through Crewbay. And then soon after I got home, one of my friends invited me to go to the Bahamas with him and another guy. That was a funny trip. The guy who owned the boat didn't know how to sail at all, literally at all. And my friend knew how to sail, and I kind of knew. And between the three of us, we made it happen. There was some MacGyvering on that trip too. But anyway, that year I bought my first sailboat. So the same year I took my 1-week class, I bought a 30-foot boat in Tampa, Florida, on the west coast of Florida. I spent 2 months working on it and learning how to sail it. Learning how to sail by myself. That was my first time sailing by myself too. I learned how to single hand. Also heavily influenced by books. There's a book called Single-Handed Sailing by Andrew Evans, which is just chock full of information directly how to sail by yourself, how to sail a boat offshore by yourself, how to tack, how to jibe, how to sleep, how to eat. Just such good information. It's like the Bible of offshore sailing, single-handed, and not just offshore. He also races, and then other books that were extremely influential. Bernard Metissier, a French single-hand sailor, wrote a lot of good books. The Long Way is the classic, and it's about he entered the very first single-hand around the world nonstop race in 1968. No one had done it before. Nobody had sailed around the world alone, nonstop, unassisted before. And so there was a race to see who could do it. And he would have won. He got all the way. It started in England, started and finished in Falmouth, England. And he got all the way around the world. And the route is south to Cape of Good Hope, and then around the Southern Ocean, all the way around the world in the Southern Ocean, around south of everything. And then back to England. He got all the way around and decided not to go back to England, but to continue and to go all the way around again to Tahiti. He decided he wanted to go to Tahiti instead of England. So he sailed around the world 1 2/3 times.
Wow.
Even though he could have won the race. And anyway, he wrote a book while he was doing that called The Long Way. And that's another classic book that's influenced a lot of single-hand sailors.
But isn't that the point? That it wasn't about the race. Like, that's the learning. It's not about the race. Like, you want to know what? No, I want to go here, and I can.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a wonderful lesson in itself.
Exactly. And that is exactly the point. You get out on the ocean and it doesn't really matter so much where you're going. often the wind changes direction while you're out and you have to go somewhere else. That happens to me in the Bahamas all the time. You leave one island thinking you're going to a different island, and halfway there the wind changes direction, and you either have to take the sails down and turn on the engine and motor against the wind and the waves to where you wanted to go, or you just change course and go somewhere else. And there's a lot of islands there. Why not? So I go where the wind blows.
Literally.
Yeah, that is the point, to enjoy yourself and to go where you want to go.
So that's it. You buy you take your sailing lesson, that week sailing lesson. You go out, you buy a boat that same year, work on it, learn how to sail it mostly through books, it sounds like. But then you have to get it back to where you were living, which was a solo journey, right?
Yes, St. Petersburg to St. Augustine via the ocean is 1,000 miles. And that's a trip I'll never be able to repeat. It was just such a wonderful, adventurous experience, full of unknowns. I left St. Petersburg not knowing if I was going to enjoy sailing offshore by myself, not knowing if I was going to be able to sleep, not knowing if I was going to be terrified at night. My first night at sea alone, like, am I going to be scared to death? Is it going to be awful? Am I going to hate this? Am I going to be seasick? Am I going to be able to sleep at all? My next destination was the Dry Tortugas. So I cut the 1,000-mile journey into 3 legs. It was St. Pete to the Dry Tortugas to Miami to St. Augustine. And I wrote a book about it. It's called Becoming a Sailor. And it was a fantastic journey. I loved it. There were some scary points, but I loved being offshore. I was able to sleep, no problem. I only sleep 20 minutes at a time when I'm offshore. And I've got instruments that detect other boats, and the sets off an alarm on my boat. And and most other boats have the same thing. It's called AIS. So it alerts both of us to who we are, where we are, whether or not we're going to run into each other, how close we're going to come, what our relative speeds are. There's a lot of information to work with, and you kind of set the parameters to set off an alarm. So I typically have an alarm go off if I'm going to come within 1.5 miles or 2 miles of somebody else. The alarm wakes me up, hopefully about 15 minutes before, and you figure out whether or not you need to change course, or you just call them up on the VHF radio. You've got the name of the boat right there on the instrument. Call them right up, talk to them, because it's often a tanker or a cruise ship or a cargo ship. Cargo ships and tankers they can't really change course. They're too big. They're going 20 knots sometimes. They're like 1,000 feet long sometimes. They can't really change course. You have to make sure they don't hit you. But they're very professional. You call them on the radio, they're very happy to talk to you and to help you decide if you need to turn to port or to starboard and sometimes they'll decrease their speed, to make sure you don't hit them. They can do that. And they can change course. It's just an extremely long, slow process. Cruise ships, I've had cruise ships offer to change course before. Everybody on the ocean is very professional and very happy to talk. But on my second night of that first trip, I came across a fleet of shrimp boats. One of the most difficult things to come across, because they're busy, they're fishing, they have right of way because they're fishing boats. They're dragging huge nets. They're changing directions. And there's like a dozen of them all zigzagging around this huge area that like encompasses the entire horizon. You look at them, you can't really tell what you're seeing because they don't have the typical red and green lights. Most boats have lights you can look at and interpret which direction they're going. Not so with the shrimp boats. And I was timid and a novice, and I don't think I called any of them on the radio, which is what I should have done. I should have gotten right on the radio and started calling them. But I didn't, and it was pitch black night, and the wind was blowing about 20 knots. And I'm a total novice, and I'm trying to go around these shrimp boats. And at one point, I thought this, I just thought a boat was trying to run me down. At one point, I finally got to where I thought I was going around him, and I saw this boat change course. And I thought to myself, this guy is just coming right at me. Like, what do I do? What am I going to do now? I've got the engine running. I'm at full power. The wind is pushing me. I can't go any faster. I was just exasperated and I was exhausted. And then I realized, oh, I'm looking at his stern. He's going away from me. Thank goodness. And I got around the boats and pulled into the dry Tortugas the next day and dropped anchor and took a nice long nap. And then after a few days, I left and had probably one of the best sailing days ever. The second day of that trip, I was in the Straits of Florida, the area between the Florida Keys and Cuba. And it was a bright sunny day and the water was just this gorgeous, bright blue color. There were seagulls flying around eating things. I remember there was a ton of Portuguese man-o-war in the water. They were like, they're purple and they float. And they look like, they're not something you want to see when you're in the water, but when you're in a boat, they just look like little purple jewels on the water floating around, decorating the water. And I was on a nice point of sail and just cruising along, having the greatest time. I remember just thinking, this is exactly what I came for. This is wonderful. And way, way out here, 50 miles from America and another 50 from Cuba or something. And that was a fantastic journey. It really was. I had some kind of scary moments going around Cape Canaveral. Looking back on it, I wasn't in any danger, but it was rough and it was cold. It was January. It was rough seas and contrary winds. And when the wind blows against the Gulf Stream current, it creates like nasty waves quickly. So I had some uncomfortable times, but I eventually got around that and got all the way to St. Augustine, pulled up to a mooring and caught the mooring and tied off. And it was like magic. I had bought this boat on the other side of Florida and somehow had gotten it there. And it just seemed really surreal. You get those feelings every now and then on a sailboat that it's just so surreal sometimes to realize how much distance you've covered on this wind powered craft that just moves along without making any noise. Mm-hmm. It's kind of magical.
So you have this amazing, your first voyage and it solidified this vision of like, yeah, this is what I want to do. You dock and now you're back in St. Augustine. So what happens to, like, were you sure at that point in time, yep, house is going on the market and this is what I need to do? Like, what was that planning like?
Well, at that point, that was a few years before the house went on the market. At that point, I realized this is a great thing. I love it. That was a 30-foot boat. It wasn't big enough. I could have lived on it, but it's not. It wasn't really big enough to live on. But I definitely, the dream was happening, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how I was going to make it happen, because you have to make money. We all have to make money one way or another. And I didn't have a good plan for how to make money while living on a boat. That was the big thing I had to figure out. And I think it was that year that I wrote my first book, Alcoholics Not Anonymous, A Modern Way to Quit Drinking. And when that book started selling to strangers, when I realized there's actually strangers buying my book, like people that don't know me, like I figured my parents probably bought the first 10 or 20 copies, and I figured some relatives and some, probably bought a few too. But after 50 or 100 books sold, I realized there are legitimate strangers buying my book. Mm-hmm. And that made me realize, okay, I've got to keep this going. So I wrote Becoming a Sailor, which was about the trip we just talked about. And that book did really well and still sells fairly well. And what really solidified the question of can I live on a boat and be comfortable was in 2018. I sailed that same boat to the Bahamas and spent 2 months sailing around the Bahamas. I wrote a book about that too. It's called Journey to the Ragged Islands. That's probably my bestseller. That was a fantastic adventure. And when I got home from that, I remember thinking I could have stayed indefinitely. I wasn't tired. I wasn't, when you come back from camping for a week, or you're dirty, your clothes all smell like smoke. Your back kind of hurts because you haven't been sleeping very well, and you're stiff and you got blisters on your feet maybe, and you're so glad to be home. Well, that didn't happen on this trip. I remember thinking like, yeah, I feel fine. I feel, I could have stayed on the boat another month, another 2 months, a year. I can live on a boat. Like, it's clear now. I can live on a sailboat. And since my books were selling, especially that one took off and sold really well. I mean, I say really well, relatively. I'm not talking about making serious money here, but well enough to keep me going. And that's when I started realizing there's a good chance I could be a writer and a sailor, just like Bernard Matessier, who wrote The Long Way. That's what I really wanted to do, sail to interesting places and write about them. So the dream was alive at that point. And I figured if I can keep writing one book a year and they keep selling this well, now I do a lot of math. We're talking, grade school math here, but that's all it takes to figure out if a plan's going to work or not. And I estimated how much money I'm going to need to live on. You just add up how much food you eat, what that costs, and what your bills are, and that's what you're going to spend on diesel and water. And figuring out how much a boat costs to own is not straightforward at all. That's kind of the big variable. But it started looking like it could work. And eventually, I had been sober and everything was changing. One of my strategies to staying sober is to do everything differently. Don't just change that one thing about yourself. It's a big change. You're a different person, and you need to remind yourself of that. You change as much as you can. If you're going for a big change like that's going to be hard to maintain, it's good to have other symbolic changes too that remind you. It's symbolism. You're like using symbolism to convince yourself that you are different now. You will not go back to the person you used to be. I can't go back to that person. I am the same person, obviously. I can't go back to that old habit of drinking heavily and smoking. I was a pot smoker too. So I'm totally sober now. Coffee is my only addictive drug. You have to reinvent yourself to quit drinking, to quit an addictive drug. You really need, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to reinvent yourself. You can change other things for the better. So I started losing interest in being a musician. It wasn't as much fun as it was before. And I wanted to live on a boat and sail and be nomadic. So eventually the time came, just sort of finances kind of came to a point where I was able to fix up my house and get it ready to sell. And I put it on the market aggressively, sold it. I didn't hold out for, the highest dollar. The timing was right. I had done the math. I needed a certain amount of money to buy a boat and to give myself enough time, enough of a cushion to start making a real living as a writer. And I do math every month. Every month I look at how much money I've got, how much I'm spending, how much I've spent per month since I started living on the boat, and then figure how many months more money do I have? How much longer do I have? So, and then I also have, I have a plan B. If my bank account gets down to a certain low threshold number, I have to go back to land, buy a truck, buy a bunch of tools, go back to work as a carpenter. But I've got about 5 years before that happens. I don't spend very much money at all out here. I live at Anchor. I don't have the only fixed bills I have are for communication, my phone, and for a satellite device I pay for that helps me communicate when I'm offshore. And it's also a safety device. I have those two bills, food. Occasionally I have to buy diesel. That's it. It's not very much at all. It's about $1,200 a month. And that includes buying some stuff too. That's like what I've spent on average so far per month. And that includes buying things for the boat too. So the plan is afoot right now. I'm going to publish a book October 20th.
All right.
My next book, called The Joy of Living Clean and Sober, will be out. And I'll have a novel out called The Gold Box fairly soon too.
I'll link up all of these books in the show notes so folks can take a look and see what you're doing there.
Thanks.
You mentioned something that I thought was really fascinating. You actually answered a question that I was going to ask. When you were talking about being out, with no one around you for all those miles, and what came to mind was, I wonder what it's like when you do have to re-engage with civilization, because that's the real life, quote unquote. You're out there, you're part of, and you're feeling part of everything connected with everything that's around you. And then you come back to pop culture, really. Like, I can't even imagine the dissonance. But when you were talking about sobriety, and I think this is fascinating, your approach is you change more, you change to the maximum. So you're changing everything around you. So there isn't that dissonance of I'm trying to wedge myself back into a life I had, but I don't do this thing anymore. Your suggestion is no, you change everything that's around you. And I would think that that would make it easier than to re-engage as you need to.
Well, yes. I mean, as far as remaining sober, one of the biggest issues we have is triggers, so things that remind us of our drinking past and encourage us to go back to it. And those are all things in your life. It's going to be driving past the liquor store. It's going to be your friends who you used to go to the bar with. It's going to be little things you don't realize, little things in your house that you see they're all part of your old habits. Selling my house and moving, like that's perfect. Just everything's gone. It's all different. Nothing reminds me of my old bad habits. That's like the extreme. If you're serious about it and you're having trouble, like just move somewhere different, show up. Everybody you meet, let them know I don't drink. And therefore no one in your new town associates you with alcohol. They all know that you don't drink. When people come onto my boat, I had a friend over for dinner last night. I had to tell him, please don't bring any alcohol. My boat is a sanctuary. There's no temptation on my boat. The more you can change, the better, I think. Get a new wardrobe, change your hair, grow a beard, get a new
I tried
job.
that. It didn't work for me.
Yep. And you have to make new friends too. You don't have to ditch all your old friends, but some of them are not going to want to hang out anymore. And even though they still like you, even though you're still their friend, most people don't know what to do. Like when you quit, most people don't know how to treat you. They're not sure if you want to be invited to their Christmas party because everybody's going to be drinking. They might think you just don't even want, like, they just don't know. The truth is I want to be invited to the party. And if I come, I'll come early and I'll leave early.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't want to be there when everybody's really getting drunk, but I'd still want to come and say hello. So that's how you treat your newly sober friends. Go ahead and invite them, but do not offer them a drink. Do not encourage them to drink. Be supportive, and really the friends that I've kept have been the people that have been supportive, and encouraging me. And I love social media for this. Social media has got its ups and downs, and it's sort of the whipping boy for a lot of things too. But Facebook has been fantastic for getting sober. I just put up a post yesterday thanking everybody who's been helping me, and I was 80 months sober yesterday.
Congratulations.
And I probably got, on the first day, more than 50 people, even people I don't know, are encouraging me, and some of them are saying that I helped them to get sober. It's fantastic. I love Facebook for that kind of exchange of information and that kind of support. And I have friends who've come out that they're sober on Facebook. And that's why I titled my first book, Alcoholics Not Anonymous. I don't have anything against AA. It just wasn't for me. I made up my own method. And I believe in today's world, it's better to be the opposite of anonymous. Come right out and tell everybody you're doing it. That way you're accountable to all of them. That way you're going to feel like a loser if you go back to drinking, because you're going to know all these people, you told them you were sober. So it helps you stay. And it helps you when they support you and they tell you, good job, I'm proud of you, keep going. All that helps. It's a very difficult thing to do. And the more support you can get, the better. And for a lot of people, AA is the way to go. It just wasn't for me.
As people get deeper with their lives, you're doing it through sobriety. Others are doing it through maybe simplifying their lives or making other changes. It feels like the thing that is scariest is that those first moments when they're really alone with their thoughts, it's just you, that you don't have that drink there anymore and you don't have the social constructs anymore. And it's just you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like that's where sailing was helpful for you because it's an active meditation,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're steering this boat, you're out there. There's more to it than just being in that quiet. Do you think that was part of your recovery and how you adjusted to this new life that you created?
Absolutely. Sailing was one of the many substitutes to drinking, and substitutes are an important part of getting sober. And I'm sure maybe it's an important part of any kind of big change in your life, because you're going to have this big empty spot. I mean, I drank every day, obviously. So every day you're in the beginning, you're going through withdrawal, and for a long time, you're going through a lot of anxiety, and your emotions go crazy. You might be angry, you might be depressed, you might have a lot of energy that you didn't have before. You have to be ready for all that. You have to have substitute activities ready to go at any minute. I had a gym at my house with weights and punching bags, and I would go out there and hit the gym, and I would take off. I live near the beach, so I would often just take off running, put on some headphones and crank up some loud, aggressive music and run to the beach. And then I started ocean swimming. I figured out, ocean swimming is scary. Like, I love to swim. Swimming in a pool is fun. Swimming in the ocean in dark water where there's sharks and you can't see them, it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're going through the beginning of not drinking, I had a lot of energy and a lot of anger, and that was a perfect outlet for it. Just get right in the water and be scared and swim and set a goal. I'm going to swim from here to that lifeguard tower that's half a mile away, or they got to where I was swimming a mile in the ocean, and it's just a great outlet. You get out of that water and you feel wonderful. I mean, you fantastic. And on top of that, now you've picked up a healthy activity. You're getting stronger, faster, more healthy. You've turned withdrawal, a terrible thing, into something positive.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went the next step. You have to meet new people when you're going through this big change. I met the St. Augustine Beach lifeguards, because they do in the off season, in the winter, they do a Saturday morning mile swim. It's like 9:30 in the morning. They all meet at the lifeguard station. The public's welcome to join them. I was the only public. And sometimes it was two of us, sometimes it was 5 or 6 of us. Sometimes it was bitter cold and rough ocean. People are out surfing in 6-foot waves, and it's cold and nasty. And we would put on wetsuits and get right out there and swim a mile and feel wonderful about it. And it's in the morning, so nobody's drinking. We sometimes go to the cafe afterwards and have a breakfast and coffee together. And I met healthy, active people. So yes, that's substitute activities. Sailing was a big substitute. It was also a substitute for all the fun I was having as a guitar player in a reggae band. We even went on tour a few times. Those were big time party moments. There were lots of fun, but I couldn't do it anymore. Going on tour in a band sober is not nearly as much fun. In fact, it's not fun at all. That's one of the things you come to realize, that if something's only fun when you're drinking, it might not be as fun as you thought it was. It's not, actually. It's not as fun as you thought it was. So performing on stage was always just as much fun. Except in the very beginning, now you don't have that crutch of alcohol and marijuana too. Oh my gosh. Performing on stage sober the first time was terribly difficult. And then it happened again, because I quit smoking weed a year later, and it was the same thing all over again. Oh my gosh, I'm not even high now. Like, I've got to get up here and play guitar in front of all these people. Oh my!
How do I
goodness.
do this?
Yeah, so I had to kind of relearn how to do that. But I also became a better guitar player, because the alcohol and the weed makes you think you are a lot better than you really are. You might be playing really sloppy and think you're killing it and think the crowd loves it. And as the more sober you get, the better you get, because you realize what you're really doing and what you really sound like, and you can really analyze things better, and you have more dexterity. You know, alcohol takes away your dexterity a lot, and the weed too, the marijuana. On the one hand, it kind of frees your mind to maybe be more creative or to not be distracted by your surroundings. But on the other hand, it kind of cripples the mathematical part of your mind, and it cripples the short-term memory. And so you need those things to play guitar. You need to remember stuff. Music is math. It is sort of a form of math. So I became a much better guitar player, sober. But unfortunately, the only part of it I enjoyed was the actual stage performance. I didn't enjoy the band practice anymore. I didn't enjoy traveling to play. Was not fun at all. So that all, I gave all that up. I had to quit the band in order to do what I'm doing now. That was a huge change. But now writing is my creative outlet, and it's a whole new wonderful experience. I mean, it's absolutely mind encompassing. To get into it, to create with words, you're creating what's happening in someone else's head, which is what music does too. Music. I wrote music. We were an original band, and you are creating emotions. You're creating a sound that brings out emotions in people, and it makes them dance and smile and have a good time. And we played reggae. It's fun, happy music. That was a lot of fun. But writing is very similar. You are creating a whole world, a whole alternate universe. You're creating it, and it's a wonderful experience. And to finish a book and publish it and send it out there. I don't have any children, but I imagine it's a lot like having a child, because those books are going to live on after me.
Absolutely, and you're inspiring people in a whole nother way.
Yes,
which is you still have that connection.
Yes, you're inspiring people in a healthy way, and I certainly try to make people's lives better through my books.
And it's far-reaching, right? I mean, there may be that feel-good moment when you're playing music, but now this has broader reach. You have global reach now, which I'm sure is very different than playing a room of folks, which is amazing.
Oh, it is.
Yeah,
it is. Yes, the influence I have now is on a whole different level. Playing music, it makes people happy right then and there. A dozen people or 100 people or 1,000 people, but it doesn't change their life. It doesn't put new ideas in their head.
Right.
And I'm not even in control of that. The singer writes the lyrics, so he might be singing about something I don't necessarily agree with, but I'm not going to say anything, because that's his part of the music. Let him do what he wants. But now I can come right out and say exactly what I think, and influence people in ways that I think is positive. And it is very far reaching. My books are sold in multiple countries, and there's, thousands of people out there reading them, and hopefully being inspired to step outside their comfort zone and do something incredible and change their life in a positive way. Either chase their dreams or quit drinking, or just, like I said, to step outside of your comfort zone. That's what's really important. That's a huge, important message. Most people live in their little comfort zone, and it might not even be that comfortable. It might be stressful, but it's still their comfort zone. It might not be their ideal life at all. They might not have ever thought about what their ideal life is. I don't think people spend enough time thinking about what really makes you happy, and what your ideal life really should be. I try to think about that a lot. For instance, what makes you happy? Well, you can start by thinking, well, when am I happy? When am I smiling and happy? And come up with 3 or 4 or 5 different times or activities or things that make you happy. And then think, okay, well, why does that make me happy? And then you'll see overlap between some of the things. And it's that overlap that's the key message. For instance, for me, being really happy would be riding a mountain bike in the forest. Very happy doing that. Scuba diving would make me happy. Just a basic example right there. You've got 2 things that happen outdoors. All right, there's the overlap. It's the outdoors. Is it the riding the bike that is really cool? Is it the breathing through an underwater apparatus? No, it's being in nature. That's what it is. So that's just a quick and easy example. But if you go through all your life and think about all the things that make you happy, figure out what they have in common. Then you can start getting towards the real root of what it is that makes you happy. And then you can start designing your life to maximize that. And that's what I've done. I have absolutely maximized nature, adventure, creativity, and solitude. I really enjoy solitude. I'm alone. I'm a single hand sailor because I'm single. I've never been married. I've had lots of girlfriends. They've never worked. They've all come, those relationships have all come to an end for one reason or another. But really, I really enjoy being alone. I enjoy the peace, the quiet, the solitude. I enjoy being on the ocean at night by myself, looking up at the stars, steering a boat, feeling the wind and the waves and the rudder and the keel and becoming a part of all that and looking up at the stars, like where a star intersects with my mast, for instance. I'll stare at that, and that's how I'll steer. I mean, you look down at your instrument to know if you're going in the right direction. Then you find a star that's in that right direction, and then you follow that star. It's fantastic. It's so much fun. Mm-hmm. And as the night wears on, the stars move, and you have to keep picking different stars. But you end up steering a boat, feeling the wind and the waves and the keel and the rudder, and looking at the heavens while you're doing it. Mm-hmm. And it's quiet, and all you hear is the water moving across the hull and the wind moving across the sails. And there's nothing like it. It's fantastic. And that is what I love and what makes me happy. One of the things.
When you're steering by starlight like that, I'm sure you're getting some thoughts about where to go next, what to do next. So let's talk a little bit about life today. And, is there a seasonality to it? How do you determine where you want to explore?
Yes, the seasonality is hurricane season. You do not want to be in the path of hurricanes. Not everybody follows this. There are plenty of sailboats in the Bahamas right now, for instance, just hoping not to get hit. But that's why I'm in Panama. I was in the Bahamas during the winter. That's a good time to be there. Nice weather. There's no hurricanes. And I arrived here in late April, right before hurricane season started. So I completely got here before that because I am outside the hurricane zone here. They don't come this far south. Panama is safe from hurricanes. So I'm here for all of hurricane season, and come December, I'll head back to the Bahamas. That's plan A. And my plans are always subject to change. I could all of a sudden decide to go through the Panama Canal and go to Mexico.
Go to Tahiti.
Tahiti or Guatemala. Yeah, who knows? Alaska, Hawaii. So that's the seasonality. You need to avoid hurricanes. You need to avoid the North Atlantic in the winter. It's too stormy. Yes, seasonality is very important, and it all has to do with bad weather. We're basically avoiding bad weather. You don't need to go looking for bad weather on a sailboat. It's going to find you eventually anyway, and it's no fun. Sailing can be the most wonderful thing in the world, and it can also be the most terrifying, miserable thing in the world too. It can really go either direction. Mm-hmm. If it's cold and rough and too windy, it's the most difficult thing in the world. It's just extremely difficult when it gets cold and windy and rough seas. You're asking yourself, why am I doing this? I would really like to be in a house taking a hot shower right now, lay down in a bed, and I'm not. I'm out here on the ocean, and it's cold and I'm wet and I'm miserable and I'm scared, and the boat is banging and moving, and I can hardly do anything without holding on, and I want to throw up. It can get that bad. It can get worse than that. Your boat can sink, and you can be in a life raft, or I interviewed. I have a podcast too, and I interviewed a guy just the other day who spent, I think he said 26 hours in the water offshore.
Wow.
While his boat hit a container. Cargo ships have those huge containers that look like train cars. They fall off all the time.
Oh, no kidding.
And some of them float. Or they float right below. The worst ones float right below the surface. It's hard to imagine them floating, but they're airtight containers. They might have buoyant stuff inside of them anyway. And if they're hovering right around the surface of the water, you can't see them, especially at night. Boats hit them sometimes and sink.
Wow.
So his boat, he was on a 21-foot racing boat trying to go all the way from like Europe to the Caribbean. And on the third day, he hit something, and his boat sank most of the way, but was still hovering at the surface. But he wasn't able to even get on his boat. He was in the water with a life jacket on for 26 hours with a VHF radio in his hand. Every 2 hours, he called a mayday, and eventually somebody answered.
Wow.
And it was a cruise ship. This is a great story. It was a cruise ship that answered, and he was able to see their smoke on the horizon. You couldn't see them, but he could see their smoke. So he directed them. He told them which direction to come, and they turned towards him. And eventually, he was able to see them and direct them right to him. And they dropped him a ladder, and he climbed aboard. And it was a cruise ship full of American, retirees.
Wow.
And eventually the captain asked him to come to a dinner and give a speech. And that led to a speaking career. The guy makes a living now speaking, giving motivational talks. Isn't that a great story?
That's an amazing story. Wow.
But that's how bad it can be. You can be treading water for 26 hours and of course it gets much worse than that too, but we don't have to go there.
Actually, can you give us an example of a typical day? So it's hard for us to imagine if we don't live on a boat. You said you always have your life vest on when you're sailing, and you're only sleeping for 20 minutes at a time if you're in open water. So just give us a sense of what that rhythm is like.
Mm-hmm. So a typical day when I am making an offshore passage, in a passage being you're crossing the open ocean between two places, I try to sleep during the day as much as possible, which is difficult. And I end up sleeping more at night than I do in the day. But I'm always trying to tell myself, okay, there's no one around. The boat's steering itself. There's nobody around. There's nothing to hit. I should take a nap right now. So I'm often just sort of telling myself, go below and take a nap. And I use a countdown timer on a watch that counts down 20 minutes and the alarm goes off. And it actually keeps running. The timer, it's a cool feature called countdown timer. After 20 minutes, the alarm goes off, but it starts counting down the next 20 minutes without you doing anything. And it'll go off again 20 minutes later, unless you make that stop. So that's what I use. 20 minutes later, I wake up. And I'm talking about just going down below and laying down with all my clothes on and my life jacket. I never take my boots off. I never take I'm often barefoot, but I never take anything off. That's the point, because you could be asleep and the AIS alarm could go off, or the boat could jibe, and you've got to get up and do something. And you don't want to have to go find your life jacket, because what you're going to do is go up without it. So you just leave it on. Mm-hmm. So I lay down with all my stuff on. And the first 2 or 3 days, that can be difficult to fall asleep. But after a day or two, it becomes very easy. So we'll say we're 4 days into a trip. Go down below, lay down, instantly fall asleep. Wake up 20 minutes later, kind of groggy. Sometimes you're a little confused, but you wake up. You realize you're on a boat. You're very motivated to get up and go look around, because you're moving. And you go up and you look around and you make the call. Do I take another nap right now, or do I hang out in the cockpit? And sometimes I'll nap 2-3 times in a row. If it's nighttime, I might just nap over and over again. It's hard to tell how many times it is. And then I'll spend a lot of time reading. I've got a Kindle, so I'll sit in the cockpit and read. I'll often put out a line and fish. I will often just stare out at the ocean. Up until just this year, I was always steering the boat when I was awake, and I would set an electronic autopilot to steer while I was sleeping. But that uses a lot of battery power. So this year I bought a hydrovane, which is a wind-powered autopilot. It's a large mechanical device that hangs off the back of the boat, and it has what looks like a small sail sticking up. And that small sail, you point it directly into the wind. So if the boat moves off course, it flops over because the wind hits it from the side. When it flops over, it turns a rudder. It has its own rudder, and that steers the boat back on course.
Interesting.
It doesn't use any electricity. It's a fantastic, magical device that's hard to even imagine. I look at it and I still don't really understand how it works, even though it's a very simple mechanical device. It's hard to imagine that it works, but it does. And that sucker steers the boat for days at a time very well. So I've been relieved of having to steer. So I spend a lot of time, like I said, reading, making sure everything is okay on the boat, looking around and checking to make sure all the mechanical things, all the mechanical fittings and little cotter pins are in the right places and the lines are right, and looking at the sails. The wind is usually changing slowly in one direction or another. It's usually moving a little bit. So you're often looking at the sails and trimming them, letting them out a little bit, taking them in a little bit. If the wind is really variable, sometimes it's going to go up and down in speed. So you have to take the sails in, like make them smaller. You have to reef them. That can be a lot of work. So sometimes I'm working a lot. Sometimes I'm just chilling out reading. Like on the way here from the Bahamas, I was hanging out reading and it was like not a whole lot of work for days at a time. It was really relaxing. I've had other passages where I'm working hard a lot of the time. I'm pulling on lines using a lot of force and effort and strength, wearing my hands, having to wear gloves because I'm having to pull on these on lines, trimming the sails because the wind is changing. If you're sailing upwind, for instance, and it's 20 knots or 25 knots, it's a lot of action. The boat is going up, bam, up and down waves, just constantly, and it's leaning over 15 or 20 degrees. Everything's difficult. Just moving is difficult. You might have to reef the sails. You might have to crank hard on winches, pull on lines. It can get difficult. So it can really be a wide variety of things. Like I was talking about earlier, it can be really pleasant and relaxing. It can be a lot of work. Sailing in the tropics, it's never cold, so I like that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go up north, you can add cold weather to all that, and then sometimes you're getting sprayed with water. When the boat's crashing through waves, it often sends up spray that sometimes it feels like someone's throwing buckets of water at you.
Mm.
So that can get rough, but when it's a good time, it is a lot of just hanging out in the cockpit, watching the world go by, and taking naps. But sleeping 20 minutes at a time is not ideal. It's just what we have to do to make sure you don't run into something. That's about the amount of time it would take to have a head-on collision with someone coming straight at you from just beyond the horizon. That's where the 20 minutes comes from.
Gotcha.
If there's a cargo ship going 15 knots and he's just over the horizon and you can't see him, he's going to be on you within 20 minutes. Now we have electronics to help us out there. Every commercial ship has AIS. I have AIS. Our boats are communicating with each other that way, letting us know where we are and who we are. And I mentioned that earlier. But I also use radar. So if there's a boat that does not have AIS, my radar will tell me, hopefully, that I'm about to hit something. So I'm using those two things also. But sleeping longer than 20 minutes, you're really pushing your luck. The point I was trying to make, though, is you are not 100% sleeping 20 minutes at a time. You're not even close to it. You're more like 50% mentally and physically.
Mm-hmm.
So you're always feeling a little weird. You're okay. I'm all right. I can go 20 minutes at a time, 7 days in a row. That's as long as I've ever been. So I can do it and I'm fine. But you're a little slow. So when you have to reef the sails, when you have to do something, you stop and think about it before you do it. And I run through all the steps in my head, especially if it requires leaving the cockpit and going forward. Then you really got to make sure you don't make any mistakes. You remind yourself of all your safety protocols. You go through all the steps about what you're going to do mentally, and then you go and do the first step, and that leads to the second and the third, and you get the job done. Because my first sailboat had hank-on sails, which means every time I had to make the head sail smaller, for instance, the wind picks up. Imagine you're sailing along at night. You've got your biggest head sail up. The wind's 10 knots. It's peaceful and wonderful. And then the wind picks up and it's 15. And now your boat is leaning way over the rails in the water. You've got too much sail up. You've got to make that head sail smaller. So you have to go down below, get a smaller sail, which is a big, heavy bag. You have to drag that to the front of the boat on the deck at night while you're crashing through waves.
Oh.
Then you have to take down the sail, which is this huge thing, and the wind's blowing, and the boat's crashing over waves. Take the sail down, unhank it, unclip all these clips, wrestle this gigantic sail into a bag, clip on the new sail, raise it. This whole process is a lot of work. It's scary, and it takes about 45 minutes. You better think out all the steps ahead of time before you go do something like that. Now I have roller furling. To do the same thing, I simply release one thing and pull on something else from the cockpit, and the sail gets smaller. It's completely different. Roller furling, the sail rolls up on itself, and you control it from the cockpit. It's fantastic. It's so much easier. But point being, sailing offshore by yourself, sleeping 20 minutes at a time, you're at about 50% mental capacity and physical capacity, and you need to take that into consideration before you do anything.
So let's wrap up with talking a little bit about what's on your horizon. What's the next big dream for you?
The next big dream for me is to sail to Newfoundland, Canada, the big island off Canada's northeast coast. For those who don't know what Newfoundland is, it's a large mountainous island with a lot of wilderness. There are not many places in the world where you have coastal wilderness. Most places in the world, most coastlines in the entire world are populated with people and houses and cities. So if you want to find wilderness from your sailboat, there aren't that many places to go. The Bahamas is one of them. There's a lot of uninhabited islands in the Bahamas. And Newfoundland has a lot of fjords, deep, long, narrow channels that you can sail up into with mountains on both sides of you, and typically a river at the end of it and a place to anchor. I mean, just imagine 1,000-foot rocky mountains rising straight up out of the ocean on both sides of you, wilderness, green trees, waterfalls, a river at the end of it. I would like to see that. And there's a lot of it. Newfoundland's covered in that. There's also whales and all manner of seabirds. And there's also cold and fog and strong winds and things that make sailing difficult. But I would really like to experience it. That's a big goal. That's one of the reasons I bought this boat. It's a boat that is sort of designed for those sort of conditions. So I would love to go to Newfoundland. I would like to also go to the Azores. For those who don't know what the Azores are, those are islands owned by Portugal, about 700 or 800 miles, I think, west of Portugal. So they're out in the ocean. They're volcanic mountains, beautiful places known for having great culture and flowers, known for having lots of flowers. If I'm not mistaken, that's where hydrangeas come from. There's a lot of wild hydrangeas there. Yeah, there's a lot of wild hydrangeas. And the house I sold to buy this boat was on Hydrangea Street. So there you
go. You're coming full circle.
Full circle. Yeah. In fact, I have an aloe plant on this boat from the house I sold. And that plant, I put it in a pot in 2018 and took it to the Bahamas. The same plant. I put it in a pot in 2018, took it to the Bahamas, used it for sunburn daily. And when it was almost gone, there was one little sprig of green plant left. It fell off the back of my boat into the ocean when I was anchored. And I thought, well, it's done. It was about dead anyway. And about an hour later, I thought, no, there was still one leaf. It's like one more sunburn treatment. Why not go get it? All right. So I jumped in the water and got it. That plant is still alive, and it's on my boat right now. It recovered from that. It recovered from being underwater.
Fell overboard. Plant overboard.
Overboard, underwater for an hour. It's like an immortal plant. Yeah, so I would like to go around, do the big loop around the Atlantic, the Azores to the Canaries to Cape Verde, back to the Caribbean. It's a big loop. But mainly, I just like sailing to interesting places, and I don't have any big goal to sail around the world. I want to see, a lot of people ask me since I'm in Panama, are you going through the canal? Well, I haven't seen the Atlantic yet. I haven't seen all the Bahamas yet. I haven't seen Canada or the Azores or any of Europe. There's no reason for me to go through the canal yet. Maybe in the future I will, but around the world is not a goal. Enjoying my time on the sailboat is the goal.
Mm-hmm. I love that. There's this nice balance of curiosity and contentment, which is very unusual. That just feels good.
Yes. Being content's important.
Yeah.
Reducing your wants and needs and appreciating what you've got and putting yourself in a place where you can and do appreciate what you have. And that's I'm very lucky to be where I am right now. I love it here. Panama is a wonderful place. Bocas del Toro is a fantastic place to be on a boat. It's very, very easy living here. It's the same weather every day. Like it's always the same temperature. It's either cloudy or not cloudy, so it changes a little bit there. But it's not like, and it's not as hot as Florida. Florida summers you're getting up to 100 degrees regularly. Here it doesn't get over 86. My thermometer in my boat's never read more than 86. It's very nice. I like it.
Excellent. Well, we're all living vicariously through you, Paul. Can you tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, and I'm sure, and how to get your books?
Well, the easiest way is through my website. That's paultrammell.com, PaulTrammell.com. And you can find links there to all my books for sale. And you can also go straight to Amazon and type in my name and find them that way. I also have a podcast. You can find that on my website, Sailing Podcast. You can find me on Instagram at trammell.paul, and YouTube, Paul Trammell.
Perfect. I'll link all that up. And wow, I feel like I've been on an amazing voyage.
Great.
So thank you so much for taking me along, for sharing that. It was a really wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you for being here.
Oh, you bet. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Wishing you safe journey. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. You too.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I know there are many ways you can spend your time. Thank you for choosing to spend it with me. Until our paths cross again, be kind to yourself and show your warrior spirit some love. If you know anyone who could benefit from today's episode, please pass it on. And many thanks for supporting the show by subscribing and leaving a review. It means a lot, and it helps others find their way to our circle. If you'd like to access the show notes, have a question you'd like addressed on a future episode, or would like a transcript of this episode, visit www.athenawellness.com/podcast. Until next time, be well.